was the day I came home from the hospital and my son had made coffee. That should have been the first sign something was wrong. In 43 years of knowing that boy, he had never once made coffee for anyone but himself. I'd been gone 11 days, a minor cardiac event the doctors called it, minor. I'd spent 11 days attached to monitors that beeped every time I rolled over, eating food that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret, and watching the ceiling tiles for so long I could describe every water stain from memory. When they finally told me I could go home, I cried. I'm not ashamed to say it. I sat on the edge of that hospital bed in my socks, and I cried like a child, because all I wanted was to sit in my own kitchen and look out at my backyard. My son picked me up. He was warm, solicitous in a way that felt slightly off, the way a salesman is warm. He carried my bag. He held my arm through the parking lot. He told me I looked great, which was a lie so obvious I didn't bother responding. When we pulled into my driveway in Barrie, his wife was already there. Her car was parked in front of the garage, which I noticed but said nothing about. She came out the front door before we'd even stopped, smiling with all her teeth, which she only does when she wants something. She kissed my cheek and called me Dad, which she never does. I'm always just referred to in the third person when she speaks to my son. Your father. Never Dad. I should tell you something about my daughter-in-law. She is not a bad person in the ordinary sense. She doesn't kick dogs or speak rudely to strangers. She is, in fact, quite charming in small doses. What she is, fundamentally, is a person who has always believed that comfort is something owed to her, and that any obstacle between her and that comfort is a personal injustice. My son has spent 20 years slowly becoming the same kind of person, though he didn't start that way. I remember who he was at 15. I try to hold on to that when things get difficult. They got me settled in the living room. My daughter-in-law had brought things from the grocery store. She put flowers on the kitchen table. Yellow ones, the kind your mother used to buy at the Metro near the Dunlop Street exit. I noticed she had also, at some point, opened the drawer in my study. I could tell because she hadn't pushed it all the way closed and the edge of a folder was sticking out at an angle. I said nothing. I sat in my armchair and drank the coffee my son had made, which was too strong and tasted burnt, and I listened to them talk about how they were going to take care of me. They put together a schedule, they said. My daughter-in-law would come by every other day. My son would handle my finances during the recovery period, just temporarily, just until I was fully back on my feet. Nothing to worry about, they said. They'd take care of everything. We just don't want you to have to think about anything, my daughter-in-law said, touching my arm. I looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked at her face. That's very kind, I said. I'd had 11 days in that hospital room to think. You'd be surprised how clearly you can see certain things when you have nothing to do but lie there and look at ceiling tiles. A few of those things I'd been avoiding seeing for quite some time. Let me go back a little. My wife Rosemary died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, which is exactly as brutal as you've heard. We had 41 years together, and I will not pretend they were all good years because they weren't. But the last few, even the last few months, were something I would not trade for anything. She knew things about me that no one else knew, and she loved me anyway, and I have not yet figured out how to live entirely comfortably without that particular fact being true. After she was gone, I restructured my life in the quiet, methodical way that I handle most things. I'm a retired civil engineer. I spent 34 years with the province, mostly working on water systems and infrastructure planning. I am not an emotional man by nature, though Rosemary would have said I became one gradually, the way a stone gets smooth in a river. After she died, I organized my grief the same way I would have organized a drainage report, step by step, practical. My estate, at that point, was straightforward. The house in Barrie was paid off. I had an RIF that had been rolling over nicely since retirement. Some GICs at the credit union laddered the way you're supposed to. A small rental property on the east side of the city that had been throwing off modest income for 12 years. Not a fortune. Comfortable. The kind of comfortable that takes a lifetime of not being foolish. 2 years after Rosemary died, my son came to me about money for the first time. He and his wife wanted to buy a bigger house. The market was what it was. Could I help with the down payment? Just a loan, he said. He'd pay it back. I gave him $40,000. I didn't ask for paperwork because he was my son. He did not pay it back. 8 months later, there was a business opportunity. His wife's brother was starting something in the trades, a renovation company, and they were looking for a small investor. Could I contribute, just as a silent partner? He looked at the numbers, he said. It was solid. I gave him $25,000. The renovation company lasted 14 months before the brother moved to Fort McMurray and the whole thing dissolved. At Christmas the following year, my daughter-in-law brought up, very gently, that it might make sense for me to simplify my estate planning. She'd been reading about it, she said. Something called a family trust, which in her description bore no resemblance to any family trust I had ever encountered professionally. What she was describing, in plain language, was a mechanism for my son to have signing authority over my accounts. I asked my family lawyer about it in January. He told me what I had already suspected. I said nothing to my son or his wife about what my lawyer had told me. And then, in March, I had my cardiac event and spent 11 days in the hospital and came home to burnt coffee and yellow flowers and a drawer that had been opened in my study. The document they'd been looking for was my will. Now, I want to be clear about something. What I am about to tell you is not the story of a man who was fooled and then got angry. I was not fooled. I had been watching for some time and I had made certain arrangements, and what happened over the next 6 weeks was not something I stumbled into. It was something I had prepared for, quietly, in my own way, while my son still believed I was a tired old man who just wanted someone to handle his affairs. The day after I came home from the hospital, my son asked me about my will. He was careful about it. He built up to it over about 40 minutes of conversation about nothing, the weather, the leaves, whether I was eating enough protein. Then he mentioned, very casually, that it might be worth reviewing my estate documents, since I'd had a health scare, and it was good to be prepared. He said he'd noticed some papers in my study that he hadn't quite understood, and he just wanted to make sure everything was in order. For my sake. I told him I'd think about it. 3 days later, my daughter-in-law called and mentioned that she knew a notary who could come to the house. Very convenient, she said. Very easy. I wouldn't even have to drive anywhere. I told her I'd think about it. What I was thinking about was a conversation I'd had the previous October, 6 months before my cardiac event, with a woman named Beverly who works at the law firm on Dunlop West that has been handling my affairs for 11 years. Beverly is not my lawyer. My lawyer is a man in his 60s named Clifford, who has the handshake of someone who still believes handshakes matter. But Beverly is the person who actually knows where everything is and what it means, and I trust her the way I trust a well-built culvert, not glamorous. Completely reliable. I had gone to see Clifford and Beverly in October because something had started to feel wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just the low-grade ambient wrongness of a system that is not performing as designed. My son had mentioned my accounts twice in the span of a month. My daughter-in-law had asked about the rental property with a casualness that was too studied. I am an engineer. I know the difference between a structure that is sound and a structure where something is beginning to fail. The signs are subtle, but they are there. Clifford and I had a long conversation. Then we made some changes. The rental property was transferred into a trust structured in a way that required 2-signature authorization for any transaction, the second signature being Clifford's. My RIF beneficiary designation was reviewed and amended. The GICs were left untouched because they were already inaccessible except at maturity, but I added a notation at the credit union that any changes to the account required in-person authorization with photo identification. Mine, specifically. The house was more complicated because in Ontario, a principal residence can't simply be transferred into a trust without tax implications. Clifford and I discussed this for a while. What we landed on was a notation in my estate documents that would complicate any power of attorney claimed significantly, combined with a letter on file with the land registry that Clifford's office would know to present if any unexpected transfer was attempted. I also opened a new checking account at a different bank. Not much in it. Just enough to look like something. This was Beverly's idea, and it was a good one. All of this happened in October. By the time my son was sitting in my living room in April asking about my will, there was very little left to take. He didn't know that. The conversation he had with his wife, the one that changed things, the one I wasn't supposed to hear, happened on a Tuesday evening about 3 weeks after I came home. My daughter-in-law had come over to make dinner, which was her way of maintaining access to the house, and my son had arrived after work. I had gone to lie down, which I did do genuinely in those weeks because recovering from a cardiac event is not nothing, and I was tired. But I was not asleep. My hearing, I should mention, is excellent. It is one of the few things that has not deteriorated with age. My vision requires correction, and my knees are a matter of ongoing negotiation, but I can hear a conversation through a door as clearly as I could at 35. They were in the kitchen. I was in the bedroom with the door open 2 inches. My daughter-in-law was speaking first. She'd spoken to someone, I gathered it was her sister's husband who works in real estate, about the house. The market in Barrie had softened, but was still reasonable. A property like this, she said, in a neighbourhood like this. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood what she meant. It was worth something. My son said something about the will, said he still hadn't seen it clearly. She said they didn't need to see it clearly. They needed a power of attorney, and he needed to bring it up again, and this time not as a question, as a suggestion from a concerned son who was worried about his father's capacity to manage things alone. I lay very still in the dark room. She said she'd spoken to someone about a form, that if I agreed to a continuing power of attorney for property, my son could manage the accounts, the house, all of it during my incapacity. The cardiac event qualified, she said. She'd been told it qualified, she said. My son was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if he won't sign?" She said, "He's 68, and he just had a heart attack, he'll sign." I stared at the ceiling. Here is what I felt, lying there. I want to be honest about this because I think it matters. I did not feel rage. I am too old for rage, or maybe I have just spent it all in other places. What I felt was grief. A specific, quiet kind of grief for a version of my son that had clearly been gone for longer than I'd admitted. The boy who used to come into my workshop and hand me tools without being asked, who knew the names of all the bits in my drill set before he was 7 years old. That boy had become someone who was standing in my kitchen discussing my incapacity as though I were a property with a zoning issue. I let myself feel that for a few minutes. Then I got up, put on my cardigan, and walked to the kitchen. They didn't hear me coming because I have learned to walk quietly in this house over 40 years. "Dinner smells good," I said. My daughter-in-law turned from the stove. The expression on her face moved through 3 or 4 phases very quickly before settling on warmth. My son looked at the kitchen table. "How long were you up?" he asked. "Few minutes," I said. "What are we having?" We ate dinner. The conversation was very ordinary. Afterwards my son did the dishes, and my daughter-in-law talked about her sister's kids, and I sat and drank tea and said very little. Before they left, my son mentioned again, very gently, that it might be worth thinking about a power of attorney, just for peace of mind, just to have something in place. I said I would speak to my lawyer. He said there was no rush. I called Clifford the next morning. I want to be honest about this part too. I was not interested in revenge in the dramatic sense. I am not that kind of person. What I wanted was for the situation to resolve itself in a way that protected what I had and, if possible, did not entirely destroy my relationship with my son, though I was becoming less optimistic about the latter. Clifford and I had already discussed back in October what to do if something like this happened. The answer was not complicated. The answer was documentation and clarity. The following week, I called my son and told him I'd thought about it, and that yes, I was willing to sign a power of attorney, and that I'd arrange for the notary at Clifford's office to come to the house. My son sounded genuinely pleased in a way that made my chest hurt. The notary came on a Thursday afternoon. My son was there. My daughter-in-law was there. What they did not know was that Clifford was also there, sitting in my study, having arrived 20 minutes earlier through the back door, which opens onto the deck. My neighbour for 22 years, a retired teacher named Gerald, was there as well, as an independent witness because Clifford had suggested it. The notary, who was Clifford's notary and had been fully briefed, presented the documents. They were not the documents my son expected. What I signed that afternoon was a very specific, limited power of attorney, restricted to medical decisions only, with explicit written exclusions for all financial and property matters. Every account, every asset, every property was enumerated in the exclusion schedule. The rental property trust documentation was attached as an exhibit. The letter at the land registry was referenced by file number. My son read the documents slowly. His wife read them faster, which told me she was the one who actually understood what she was looking at. "This isn't," she started. "It's a medical POA," Clifford said, coming through from the study, "which is what your father needs and what is appropriate given his health situation. Everything else is already structured." "You were here?" my son said. "I've been your father's lawyer for 11 years, Clifford said pleasantly. "I try to be present when he signs documents." There was a long moment. Gerald, God bless him, poured himself more tea from the pot on the coffee table as though nothing unusual was happening. My daughter-in-law set down the papers. She looked at me directly for the first time all afternoon. I looked back at her. I have spent 34 years assessing whether a structure will hold. I have made that determination about things made of concrete and steel and clay and gravel. I have been wrong occasionally, but not often. She said very quietly, "You knew?" "I'm 68, I said. "I had a heart attack. I'm not confused." My son did not look at me. He looked at the table, the way he used to look at the floor when he was a boy and had broken something and couldn't figure out how to explain it. I left shortly after. My daughter-in-law did not say goodbye. My son, at the door, stopped and turned back. He looked older to me in that moment than I had ever seen him look. There were things on his face that I did not quite have words for, not guilt exactly, something more complicated. "Dad," he started. "I know," I said. He nodded. He left. Clifford and Gerald stayed for another hour. Gerald talked about his tomatoes. Clifford drank tea and reviewed some paperwork with me, neatly, efficiently, the way things should be done. By 5 o'clock they were both gone, and I was alone in my kitchen with the yellow flowers, which I have moved to the counter, and which were, I noticed, starting to turn at the edges. Another few days, and they'd be done. I made myself dinner. Nothing fancy, just a piece of salmon, some rice, some frozen vegetables that I'd had in the freezer since before the hospital. I ate at the kitchen table and looked out at the backyard, which was going green in the slow, reliable way it always does in May. The lilac bush by the fence just starting to show colour. My son called 2 weeks later. We talked for about 20 minutes. He did not apologize exactly, but he said some things that were close to an apology, in the way that certain people can only manage. I told him I was doing well. I told him I hoped he was too. I meant it. My daughter-in-law has not called. The rental property is still generating income. The RIF is untouched. The house, which is mine and which I have lived in for over 2 decades, is still mine. I had my 6-week cardiology follow-up last Thursday. The doctor said everything looked good. Better than expected, she said, for a man my age. I walked back to my car through the hospital parking lot, and it was one of those April days in Ontario that arrives like an apology for winter, the kind of light that makes everything look like it did 30 years ago. I sat in the car for a few minutes before I drove home. Rosemary would have had thoughts about all of this. She always had thoughts. She would have been angry in a way I couldn't quite manage, and then sad in a way I couldn't quite manage, and then she would have said something very specific and accurate about my son that would have made me feel better without entirely solving the problem. I know that about her, the way I know the load tolerances of every bridge I ever signed off on. Precisely, without question. I drove home. The lilac by the fence had opened while I was out, the whole bush gone purple and smelling the way lilacs smell, which is one of the things I have never in 68 years gotten used to, the smell of lilacs in May. I stood at the fence for a while before going inside. Then I went in, put the kettle on, and sat down in my armchair. My house, my kettle, my chair. Nobody had made coffee. That was just fine. I still think about the coffee, That burned too strong cup my son made the morning I came home. He'd never made coffee for anyone in his life, and there it was, a gesture so careful it gave itself away entirely. That is the thing about actions that come from calculation rather than instinct. They almost always land slightly wrong. A degree or two off true, the way a wall looks fine until you hold a level against it. I don't say this to be hard on him, I say it because I spent a long time trying to understand how we got there, the two of us, sitting across from each other in my kitchen while he asked about my will with the same voice he used to ask for an extension on his curfew. The answer, when I finally sat with it honestly, was not simple. Greed rarely arrives fully formed. It comes in stages, each one small enough to excuse. First it was a loan, then an investment, then a conversation about simplifying my estate. Each step followed naturally from the one before, and at each step there was a choice. He made his choices. So did I. What I had on my side was time and clarity, not wisdom in any grand sense. I am not a wise man particularly, I am a methodical one. There is a difference. Wisdom sounds like something you arrive at. Methodical is something you practice, every day whether you feel like it or not. When something started to feel structurally unsound last October, I did not wait for certainty. I went to Clifford. I asked Beverly. I put the right things in place quietly and without announcing them because integrity, doing the right thing, the careful thing, the honest thing, does not require an audience. And I kept my eyes open. That matters more than people think. There is a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with what you know and everything to do with what you are willing to see. I was willing to see that the drawer in my study had been opened. I was willing to see that the warmth of my daughter-in-law's smile was calibrated rather than felt. I was willing to see, when I lay in that dark bedroom listening to them talk about my incapacity, what was actually happening in my own house. Seeing clearly is not always comfortable, but it is the only honest starting point. The hard part, the part that required something I can only call stubbornness of character, was staying steady through all of it, not reacting, not calling my son that evening and unloading every grievance I'd been quietly holding for 2 years, sitting with what I knew and waiting for the right moment, with the right documentation and the right people in the room. That kind of patience is not passivity. It is, I think, the most active thing I have ever done. My son called 2 weeks after that Thursday. He said things that were close to an apology. I accepted them for what they were, which was the best he could manage at that particular moment. I am 68 years old, and I have made my own approximations of apology over the years. I know what they cost. The lilac by the back fence is still blooming. The house is still mine. And I have learned, more firmly than I knew before, that the structures that protect you are only as good as the attention you give them, which is true of drainage systems, of legal documents, and of the people you choose to trust. Build carefully, watch closely, hold the line.